Brian, I've got a quote from you here, which you made to a banker roundtable earlier in the year, where you said, based on developing trends, we see a broad range of opportunities in the market. These include the development of liquidity cash optimization solutions from more mature markets such as the US and Western Europe to the vibrant emerging markets, better connectivity for our clients, more efficient usage of working capital, and more use of bank agnostic channels, continuing to improve risk management from a client's viewpoint. So perhaps we could start with the liquidity thread there, and tell us a little bit about how you see liquidity being impacted by the regulations, and also how you're going to be able to help clients deal with some of these problems.
So from a customer point of view first, I think the crisis did two things really. First of all, it made customers worry more about where their liquidity was sitting in the system. And so that has issues for us as transaction banks about visibility and transparency within the system. And with the help of technology, clearly we can always invest in creating greater visibility about where the client's money is at any point in time in the settlement chain or sitting on a current account within the system. So liquidity is in part about information and about timeliness of information and about visibility from a customer's point of view. It's also about counterparty risk management that we talked about earlier. So it's not just where it is in the system, but it's actually overnight where it's going to reside. And that's about counterparty risk management as well. So those two things from a liquidity point of view, I think the crisis from a risk management and visibility point of view put that much higher up the customer's agenda.
Yeah.
Equally, if we then look at it from a regulatory point of view, because I felt that the most regulators around the world were concerned post the crisis about liquidity, as Karen said, it's liquidity which becomes the crunch issue for banks in a crisis. Ultimately capital, but at the point of crisis, it's liquidity. It's money not being in the ATM machines on the high street.
I mean, one of the other issues that's come up is that regulators are asking to have liquidity in a particular legal entity in a particular country, aren't they? Mm-hmm. Whereas we all know that to provide a reasonable global cash management business, you want to have liquidity moving around all over the place. How do you think we're going to deal with that contradiction?
I think from a cash management perspective, it is not so difficult because this is in the client's name. I think the issue is for banks when they are looking to offer credit facilities, where the demand for credit may not be where the supply of liquidity is. So the challenge is really setting up procedures which essentially allow you to do syndicated loans across your different locations to allow you to spread the funding around at the same time as complying with all the local regulations in terms of accepting that credit.
But I think there is a conflict here between what you might call globalization on one hand and localization on the other hand.
That's what I was kind of getting at.
Which was, globalization was rampant, if you like, in the run-up to the crisis. And liquidity and capital and flexibility of movement of capital and payments and everything else was moving around the world's economy with high volatility. I think the regulators are now seeking to regulate by legal entity more within a jurisdictional point to make sure that a bank or a subsidiary within a country is appropriately capitalized and has the right amount of liquidity. Yes. And that is in a contrast to what was happening previously under globalization, where liquidity was flowing very freely around the world.
Yeah, yeah. Central, I mean, do you recognise that as an issue for both banks and maybe corporates too?
For corporates, I think it's based on the local establishment. So they were kind of tied to the geography. But for banks, there was only, they had actually two different business models. One was to capitalize at the country or at a regional level, like they've done it in Europe. Most of the banks have done it in other countries.
And on that one, I mean, presumably again, there's a discussion with the regulators. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's actually been quite a lot of discussion here about it. Mm-hmm. Do you think they're beginning to take on board the comments?
I think there is recognition of the issues, and you're seeing discussions around whether retail funding should be separated from wholesale funding. Yeah. That immediately makes a huge difference, because the funding that tends to move around the fastest and is the wholesale part of the book. And that's where the big facilities will be as well. I think the challenges will be for institutions that rely on huge amounts of retail deposits in order to fund their wholesale
business.
In other countries, particularly.
particularly in other
Yeah,
countries.
yeah. And if you're talking to sort of smaller banks, which a lot of your services for smaller banks, I mean, how can you assist them to improve their liquidity?
So well, the banks themselves have to improve their liquidity against their local regulator, that is their lead regulator in their country. So there's an advice and knowledge-based question there about making sure that we can help them comply with what is the requirement in their country. But I also think it comes back to some of the big flows. If you take euros, sterlings and dollar clearing activity around the world, we want to, for all the participants that are in those systems with us, we need to make sure that it's efficient for them.
Yeah, all right. Now, it's interesting you mentioned the major currencies there, euro, dollar, sterling. Karen, tell us a little bit about the same sort of issues as regards Asian currencies, and particularly we're seeing a rise in the use of Chinese renminbi to settle transactions, trade transactions.
Well, I think the major change that has happened over the last 18 months is actually the rise of the RMB as a trade settlement currency.
Yeah.
We've seen the quantities rise tenfold in the last year, and we're now up to a trillion RMB a month in trade settlement. So that's a really very substantial amount.
Yeah.
And when you talk about differentiation, as I said, it's difficult for the corporate to differentiate. It's much easier in these type of regions because the differentiation between the different banks and solutions is really there. And you talk about obviously the RMB. I remember last year there was an opening in terms of the ability for the banks to use, or for the corporates to use the cash which was locked in China as a collateral for debt being rising outside of the country.
Okay, all right. Well, we're talking about sort of new services and ways for banks to stay competitive. Let's return a little bit to the sort of technology input into this. And I've got a quote here which was in a banker publication. It's called "How to Run a Bank," actually, very appropriately. And it's it's written by a transaction banking expert. He says transaction banking is a common area of revenue leakage due to fee waivers, underbilling and occasional limitations in the bank infrastructure to effectively capture tier pricing arrangements. Senator, is that
Yep,
a description of bank technology that you would recognise there?
Yes, especially in the GTS business, if you can't net everything that you are transacting, your ability to earn revenue, even if you had a price advantage, goes down. But if you had a very good price in the market and you are able to track everything that is going in and coming out, I think the revenue will be much higher than what you expected in the previous regime. So we have seen that change when you actually standardize on products, accounting, and build the multi-country capability in execution. Automatically this kind of gets rolled out. But there are very specific investments in transaction banks today just to track and bill based on the customer contract. So you can tweak the customer contract to the last branch of the customer where they do 10 transactions and give a special price there and bill according to that. So there is capability to kind of go down the tree and be very specific to a particular transaction type and a customer.
Yeah.
There is nothing best than, if the corporate is able to have a kind of a global billing system, to make it simple, a kind of drill down function where you can say what he's paying globally, what he's paying in that region, what he's paying for that service, what he's paying in that particular branch. Well, the moment where the banks will be able to provide that on a consolidated basis, I can tell you that a lot of corporates will be happy to get that.
It's also an important part of customer service.
Yeah.
Because if you have a major multi-currency contract with your customer for delivering transaction banking services, you have an obligation, I believe, to be transparent about what the cost is, to bill them in accordance with the contract and make it clear to them. I think now you have the opportunity with the technologies available to do that, and you have the opportunity to give them online tools to make inquiry about it as well, so that they can do a lot of own customer service inquiry online to interrogate their own bills and understand them better.
Yeah. Karen, are you finding that customers are being more inquisitive about the bills and want to get more itemised, or?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think from the billing point of view, now obviously, as you pointed out, as banks get better at at billing correctly, the numbers don't tend to go down for the corporates, so that's not necessarily to their advantage, unfortunately. But I think
No, but they
I
feel
think
better that they're getting paying only for what they use.
they like the transparency. They may not like the number at the end. But I think the whole thing that you were mentioning around reconciliation, any way that the banks can provide easy access to information, consistent, transparent, automated in a manner that nets things off and doesn't create manual work for the corporates is obviously very advantageous, because one of the things we're finding is like the banks, the corporates their margins are also being squeezed consistently every year, and so ways that they can automate or reduce manual operations and reduce their own costs are very, very critical.